Do you know what? This stuff gets absolutely everywhere. Oh, hi. Let me just clean up a sec. I've been, playing Prodeus recently. It gets a bit messy. Just a smidge. The last time I made a video on Prodeus was well over a year ago, casting an eye over it in its nascent pre-alpha form. There was only one level, and overall I was intrigued by the potential that I could see in that particular vertical slice. If I had any worries at the time, it was chiefly that it wasn't particularly wowing me with how the weaponry felt to use, and that it was hewing pretty close to its source inspirations, running the risk of simply feeling like a dressed-up derivative of Doom rather than its own particular thing. Between now and then, however, things have certainly changed. For one, this publicly available early access version of Prodeus is clearly a much more significant release, bringing with it not only a fairly chunky batch of campaign levels, but also unfettered access to Prodeus's built-in level editor and map browser, enabling players to seek out and even publish their own creations. And believe me when I say there's already some tremendously creative stuff going on here, even at this early stage. For the purposes of this video, however, I'm largely going to be focusing down on the currently available campaign offerings of Prodeus. As for what exactly the heck is going on in the story of Prodeus, you know, it's the usual. Some kind of interdimensional conflict between demonic chaos creatures, hubristic humans, and maybe the Protean race itself? I'm not entirely sure. It's all very light on the ground at this point, and quite frankly, who gives a shit? You know what you're here for, and mercifully, so does Prodeus. It's a wonderfully no-nonsense introduction. Here's how you open a door. Here's how you jump. Got it? Great. Now press this button, open a dimensional rift, and go beat the bright blue heck out of the first thing that has the misfortune to manifest in front of something with fully functional fists. Despite being more than adequate for the first enemy you come across, fisting alone is not going to be good enough for the small army of bright blue feckers that show up shortly after. This is, coincidentally, where running gets introduced, and shortly after your escape, you get introduced to the true meat and potatoes of Prodeus, shooting something in the face. It's a breathless introduction, showing off impressive lighting, architectural flair, a smattering of environmental storytelling, and a taste of chunky combat in the space of a brief few minutes before a portal unceremoniously drops you off in the first map proper, Sacrum. Enemies here are noticeably less luminous, however, that does not detract from the simple joy of painting the grey surroundings a fresh coat of crimson, thanks to the incredible surplus of blood. Where did they get it from? Maybe it's just a consequence of demonic possession. From here on in, the most apparent influences of Prodeus certainly come to the forefront, most obvious of which certainly being Doom. To such a degree, it's honestly difficult for me not to refer to enemy types via a Doom analog. You've got former humans, you've got shotgunners, you've got imps, you've got these floaty caco-like things that fire projectiles. That said, when it comes to the maps themselves, there's certainly more of a Quake flavor to them, maybe even a smattering of build engine influence in their DNA, complex, layered endeavors that twist and turn and loop back upon themselves while also retaining an impressive sense of direction and purpose. It certainly doesn't hurt that these maps make fantastic use of lighting, with practically every source of light, even the ambient glow of items, augmenting the look and feel of a location. As hinted at before, when it comes to making your own particular mark on the environment, blood is certainly the medium of choice. It's very much plentiful in supply, but as for how you liberate it from your enemies, Prodeus has a pleasingly meaty selection of weapons for you to choose from. The early batch of weapons is most assuredly an improvement on what I originally experienced in the Prodeus pre-alpha. The pistol now feels much punchier, easily removing limbs from lesser enemies with its primary, while the secondary provides a more focused burst fire alternative. The shotgun provides admirably satisfying short to mid-range damage dealing, with up-close blasts not only removing limbs from lesser enemies, but also potentially turning them entirely into mulch. The secondary is augmented from what I recall in the pre-alpha. It remains an incendiary shot that can deal damage over time, but now you can charge it. A full charge proving to be quite useful indeed when it comes to the chunkier enemies in Prodeus's roster. Next on the list of acquisitions would be the Shredders. These appear to be dual-wielded SMGs, and they have the wonderful boon of being able to unleash a furious hail of bullets that is again probably more suited to the close to mid-range encounter. I mean, sure, you could get additional accuracy by only pulling one trigger instead of both, but if we're going to be honest here, why even live? As far as opening statements go, I think it's safe to say that the initial level of Prodeus here makes for a pretty compelling argument, and it's one that Prodeus only doubles down on as you progress deeper through the campaign. Somewhat pleasingly, the intermission between levels here also provides you with a top-down view of a world map. Completed levels marked with what else but a belch of blood marking your passage. Something you'll notice here is that while certain levels are locked off by standard linear progression, some are also locked off by how many runes you've yet to acquire, providing access to alternative routes and additional levels. While at this point it simply amounts to extra stuff you can track back to once you've acquired enough runes, it certainly has interesting implications for what may come later down the line. Back to the weapons, if you were wondering how long it is before you can trade in the Shredders for the minigun, fear not, it's essentially your reward for reaching the end of the subsequent level, Research. Only, you'll have to beat a minigunner for it, and be warned, these guys are a fair bit hardier than the standard possessed counterparts, forcing you to make canny usage of any available cover lest you find yourself torn asunder. That said, it's well worth the effort. Oh boy, is it ever! As for Research itself, it's a level that certainly ups the intensity. A section of particular note would be during the amplification chamber, where you acquire the rune and then promptly find yourself in an extremely hectic arena encounter. Just as an aside here, this is also where, if it were even possible, my ears would personally write a letter of heartfelt thanks to Andrew Hulsholt, who at this point has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that when it comes to laying down absolute bangers to bludgeon to, he has this shit thoroughly on lock. Honestly, if these tracks slapped any harder, they'd be accused of grievous bodily harm. A short tram ride from the end of Research sees you arrive in Wretch, a level that has you violently plunging into its imposing depths, skirmishing across a canyon floor, before eventually being rewarded with a rocket launcher for your troubles. The primary on this one does pretty much exactly what you'd expect. A satisfying feeling launch lets slip a rocket, which swiftly careens into enemies, delivering a beefy feeling impact. It does a fine job making mincemeat of not only clustered lesser enemies, but also your typically hardier ones, which ideally you'll want to be saving your ammunition for. Cleaving your way onwards, you'll find yourself enjoying a brief dip in a sewage agitator. You'll rampage your way upwards through the opposing side of the facility, activate access to the tram station, paint the walls red, and then continue on your merry way. Honestly, a really enjoyable level. Reaching the end of the line finds you in the opening sections of Genesis Part 1, a transport hub that seems to have seen much better days. Navigating some precarious corridors and dealing with the occasional demon in a crate, you'll soon find yourself fending off an ever-increasing barrage of enemies as you descend the slopes of the crater, culminating in a hefty feeling final encounter featuring a familiar-looking glowing enemy as its centerpiece. Turn him into mulch and you'll swiftly find yourself in Part 2, whereupon you are quickly introduced to the arc rail. This was something that was tantalizingly out of reach during the intro section, and is an absolute demolisher of a long-range rifle, which isn't even its primary function. That's its secondary, which flips it on its side and allows you to use that chargeable sight. The primary, it's okay. I mean, it's not bad, it's just not as cool as the secondary. It does a decent degree of pew-pew with the additional benefit of the charge chaining itself between nearby enemies, and trust me, you'll be doing a lot of that, considering that by the time you battle your way down to the lava pits surrounding the facility in this level, you will be knee-deep in enemy encounters. A bit of button pushing drains a section of lava, allowing you access to the facility's interior, whereupon you'll stumble across what is essentially a mini-boss encounter. This only really pops up maybe once or twice during the course of what's available here, and has an attack that slings energy waves in your general direction with its big old gangly arms. It's an intimidating look, I'll give it that, but when it came down to brass tacks, it didn't really last too long in the face of heavy, sustained Daka. Now from here, you could move forward, or you could head back and unlock Chaos Generator, which is something I heavily recommend because it's fun as heck, and it's not going to take up too much of your time. It's a relatively short side level that'll also introduce you to the Void Reaper enemy type. It's kind of the centerpiece of the level, hidden behind a shield that you'll progressively weaken as you rotate around the map. Eventually, you'll be able to take the sucker out, at which point all hell breaks loose and the area at large becomes one great big battle arena. Seriously, it's great. Beating that map will get you access to yet another side map called Memoriam, which is essentially where high-tier Kickstarter backers for Prodeus get to flex the gargantuan E-pins. But Prodeus being Prodeus, you also get to make a wonderful mess of the place. Resuming the regular flow of the campaign trail, we next reach Excavation. Hold on a sec, I remember this one. This was the map that featured in the pre-alpha demo. From what I can tell, not a massive amount of changes structure-wise, certainly looking a bit nicer than before. Also has the added bonus of introducing you to the grenade launcher. The grenade launcher, probably the most dangerous weapon in Prodeus for me to personally wield. It boasts a bouncing primary that'll detonate on contact with an enemy, and a sticky nade secondary, which I heavily recommend not using on enemies like the Lunger because, oh shit, it's got quite the surprising damage radius. Absolutely great for clearing out large infestations or even taking out enemies behind cover. Just make sure you give yourself enough room to evade the blast. From here, the introduction of new weaponry dries up for a short while, and what do we have left if not weapons? Well, how about the copious amounts of level design porn? Not to imply that the levels I've already breezed past here didn't have any lascivious aspects, but let's face it, I have only so much time to ramble in any given video, and only so many tissues left with which to wipe up the mess. Tissues in hand, we swiftly move on to Marksman, literally a monument to the concept of introducing a fresh enemy type and presenting a level that takes full advantage of the roving, laser-targeted eyes of the arc rail sniper. Oh sure, you could try and snipe them back with your own arc rail, but guess what? They're protected by a one-way shield. Instead, this level will have you skirmishing your way between cover, balancing the intensity of each encounter with the knowledge that if you don't watch your surroundings, you'll probably get an arc rail shot straight up the jacksie. Suffice to say, by the time you reach the tower that houses said snipers, you'll be quite possibly frothing at the mouth with an undeniable urge to tear them asunder, which makes it all the sweeter when you're finally presented with the opportunity. Following a claustrophobic battle through some train carriages, this same level brings the Rune Extractors back into the fold. You might remember these from the intro level, familiar enemies shot through and powered up by what I assume is Protean blue. There's not too many to deal with here, but it's certainly a foreshadowing of encounters to come. By the way, can't help but really enjoy the doors in this game. I mean, look at that door. That's a nice goddamn door. Descent. What can I say about Descent other than it is just cool as heck. This one revolves around a central chamber containing a new, suspiciously blue-tinged enemy type. This one has the ability to power up standard enemies into that Rune Extractor form that you'll have seen earlier, and each progressive floor providing a series of downright chunky combat encounters which inevitably lead to switches that remove these gargantuan plugs from the central structure, allowing you to delve even deeper. A few satisfying plug extractions later, and you'll find yourself at the finale on the bottom floor, having you facing off against that new enemy type in one heck of an intense encounter. I didn't know up until this point that lunges, those pinky-like enemies, could also get powered up into Rune Extractors, but now that I do, I fear them a heck of a lot more. Much like the Marksman, this is just a fantastic example of a neat concept realized and executed with just a really high degree of quality. It is honestly brilliant stuff. Speaking of neat concepts, Hazard is a map all about the concept of raid. You've got a lake of acid, you've got these neat shootable platforms that'll help you traverse it, and a sequence of switches that'll raise the acid level ever higher. Each raising of the level will bring new sections of the map within reach, leading you neatly on to the next switch that will activate the next pump in the sequence. Oh, by the way, remember when I said that the weaponry dries up for a short while? Well, consider the drought over. Say hello to the plasma rifle, which in the finest tradition of plasma-based weaponry absolutely melts. Secondary has a neat function allowing you to fire off a homing beacon into a nearby enemy, whereupon you'll be able to let rip and watch those delightful little blue balls of death find their mark. Lots of fun to use, so much so that I kind of irresponsibly drain my ammo supply through sheer overuse, so I'd just say maybe watch out for that. But ultimately, during the course of this, you'll find your way to the top, where you'll find, what else? A rune. But after the last few levels, acquiring runes now means you get to deal with a fresh batch of rune extractors, including that bigger kahuna that appeared during the course of Descent. Once you've dealt with that immediate problem, you'll be able to witness some interesting infighting occurring back in the larger part of the level. As it happens, non-powered up enemies don't seem to like powered up enemies all that much, which is quite handy in this case when it comes to drawing troublesome sniper fire away as you traverse that redrained canyon on your way back to the exit. Following on, Meltdown provides a level that keeps that intensity high, seeing you breach either side of a reactor complex in search of keycards to bring back to the central chamber. It's a little like Excavation in that regard, only with a wider scope, featuring more acids, and also a crap ton more enemies to deal with, including a new variant of the Rune Extractor, because if they weren't troublesome enough already, now you've got invisible varieties. I say invisible. They're vaguely visible as some kind of threatening smudge, but yes, they are a surprise nonetheless. Meltdown is not as overtly conceptual, let's say, as the last few levels with regards to its design, but that doesn't stop it from being any less than a tremendously solid experience, each section looping you outwards before neatly depositing you next to a shortcut route that lands you back in that core section of the map. Suffice to say, you cause a meltdown. Spoilers, I mean, the clue is in the title after all, and this results in a big fat sod-off fight back in that core chamber. You've got all sorts of bullshit to deal with. You've got Void Reapers, you've got Rune Extractors, almost everything seems to make an appearance here, and all the while a meltdown percentage keeps ticking up, making you wonder if you'll actually manage to escape this place before getting yourself thoroughly irradiated. Good fun! Surviving the final ordeal of Meltdown will lead you to the final map of the campaign as it currently stands, the Forge. In comparison, this is a level that feels a little bit more subdued in comparison to the last few. It begins with a short atmospheric trek across the blasted landscape before landing you in a nearby facility, where I'm embarrassed to admit that it actually took me a little while to figure out that you need to shoot doors in order to unlock them. Worming your way deeper, you'll find a few environmental opportunities to squish enemies, before eventually leading yourself to the last weapon on the Prodeus list as it currently stands, the quad shotty. That's right, we're skipping the double barrel, we're going all the way to quad. I'm not sure how much needs to be said about the quad shotty. It's a quad shotty. When you absolutely positively have to mince an enemy, fire everything. Not entirely sold on how this weapon currently sounds though. When I think quad shotty, I think of the kind of weapon that requires shock dampeners built into your armor if you enjoy the sensation of having an unbroken wrist. Does it mince? Yes. Could it mince harder? Absolutely. As for the meat of the Forge itself, there's good use of its molten metal theming, having it pop up as a hazard in the midst of various encounters, having you traverse it by way of moving platforms, and spicing it up by having you deal with those previously established shoot-switch obstacles. Naturally, it also boasts its fair share of satisfying exploration and chunky encounters, but as previously mentioned, even with its latter phase being spiced up with the by now obligatory invasion of Rune Extractors, it doesn't get the blood pumping quite as hard. Not to imply that this is a drop in quality, however, merely the feeling that if Prodeus were a roller coaster, this would be the kind of level where you catch your breath before the next plunge. When it comes to the average here, however, levels rarely, if ever, fall short of anything less than great. So much so that the end of level rating system here feels like it could do with an option that allows me to select something more emphatic sounding than merely good. Battling your way back to the forge entrance and putting your hard-won keycard to use, you gain entry to the tram, and that's it. You get a text prompt informing you that that's all for now campaign-wise, and as you might imagine, my most immediate gut reaction was...
more.
I'm not sure I can quite convey just how good it feels to have my expectations thoroughly surpassed, especially at this relatively early stage. I'll freely admit, the pre-alpha didn't entirely convince me, but what's available here in this early access version of Prodeus shows a true conviction in making this something that can stand strong on its own 2 feet. Sure, the inspiration is still clear as day, but it's telling that midway through these levels, I stopped thinking about everything in comparison to Doom or Quake, and started thinking about Prodeus more on its own merits, of which there are many. The level design, in my opinion, is quite frankly stellar. I'm a big fan of the architectural look of a lot of these levels, intimidatingly industrial, almost monolithic in certain stages. You already know how I feel about the soundtrack, absolutely in love with it, and I'm a big fan of how the sound design is working out here. The guns, certainly a massive improvement on what I experienced in the pre-alpha, and I'm greatly looking forward to seeing how Prodeus further develops these intriguing Rune Extractor enemy types. Not to mention the additional weapons that we'll eventually get to use against them. Difficulty-wise, I found this quite the satisfying challenge for my first time playthrough on medium. I would probably dial it up a little bit higher if I chose to return to the campaign, but something that you may have noticed during the course of these levels is that rather than allowing you to save wherever you wish, you actually have to make use of specific checkpoints. Now, at first I didn't quite know how to feel about this, but as it happens, the checkpoints themselves are very, very generous, not just in terms of placement, but in terms of what happens when you actually die. Typically, you'd expect everything from that point onwards to respawn. You'd have to fight through it again, have another crack. But no, as it happens, whatever you've killed since triggering that checkpoint remains dead, and you get to just continue on. At least that seemed to be the case during the last section of Meltdown, where the lunges that started the fight in the arena certainly weren't there when I respawned. That said, usage of a checkpoint is not without cost. It does count towards your overall rating at the end of any given level, and I guess it's down to your own personal sense of pride whether or not you'll want to go back and ace it in one go. Naturally, what I've covered here is just the Cliff Notes version of what you can experience in this version of Prodeus. There's a smattering of sub-enemies scattered throughout, lava-filled bug creatures, flying, homing, explosive buggers, corrosive blood hazmat zombies, all sorts of good stuff. You've got other diversions, such as the weapon challenge maps. Had quite a bit of fun with these. They encourage you to post your best times as you run a shoot-switch gauntlet with a particular given weapon. And of course, you have the terrifying potential of the level editor, which, as I mentioned right at the top of this video, has managed to produce some really creative stuff. And of course, there are remakes of classic Doom maps. I mean, why wouldn't there be? It's just the done thing. All things aside, would I recommend you pull the trigger on Prodeus right now, even in early access form? I think personally that's got to be an emphatic yes. As I've said a few times in the past, it's truly a great time to be a fan of the so-called boomer shooter. We are absolutely spoiled for choice in that regard, and from what I've experienced, Prodeus is shaping up to be yet another jewel in that ever-expanding crown. It's certainly going to be a game that I eagerly run back to whenever I catch wind of an update adding additional campaign levels, and yeah, I'm really excited to see what places this will go. But in closing, I will simply repeat my sentiment from earlier.
More.
There aren't any more.
More. More.